What will the economy look like after the pandemic? Already, politicians are trying to claw back government debt, even as the virus still ravages through the world. Britain seems to think it's all over, even though the infection rates are incredibly high. Parts of Australia seem destined for lockdowns for months to come. So what shape will business be in, and how do we fix unemployment, which is still many millions more in the United States than it was at the start of the pandemic, with expectations of the speed of the recovery significantly curtailed all over the world. So what about the world after the pandemic? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, one thing we do know about life after the pandemic, which could be years away yet, couldn't it, if we're being honest? One thing we do know is that governments are going to say that they are heavily in debt, and so will corporations. We also know, thanks to the work of central banks, that the rich are going to be richer and the poor, well, many of them won't have a job. So, I mean, Steve, will we have learned anything after all of this, do you think? Or is it just back to life as normal?
That's the trouble. I mean, we're already starting to unlearn it. I mean, I've seen, what's the Chancellor's name in the UK?
Rishi Sunak is the guy.
Okay, Sunak.
Always immaculately dressed.
Okay. Coming out and saying we've got to have, austerity and taxes afterwards to make up for the huge debt we've accumulated. Now, that's the exact opposite of what modern monetary theory had made so much headway in pointing out that governments don't tax to spend. They spend and then tax the money out of circulation. And my point has always been, look, if you look at the Second World War, how did they find all the money to finance the incredible increase in armaments and all the people on full employment because you're in the army, or your wife who used to be back at home is now working in a factory as Rosie the Riveter? How did they find the money? They created it by running the deficit. So if that...
But it's too late now, isn't it? Because they've already gone down the road of issuing bonds, and so now they've done that. I mean, they've got to, people have put money into those bonds. Some of, a lot of it is the central bank, admittedly, so they can, presumably they could write that off if they wanted to, but a lot of it is out on the open market. So it's too late to do that now, isn't it? Because they've issued the bonds.
No, they can buy the central bank could buy all the bonds, and it doesn't matter anyway. The bonds themselves, the money to buy the bonds that the banks initially used to do it is created by the deficit. There are things we could have learned out of this and said, hang on a sec, all the constraints we thought that meant government had to tax after a large spending spree like the COVID is unnecessary. And it could be actually liberating to know that. But it appears that the tone is already being set to go back to austerity after COVID. And
because of this big fear that we've got, government debt, public sector debt now at around 100% of GDP. But, as you said, I mean, after the war, it was 250% of GDP in the UK. And even in 1957, when we had Howard Macmillan saying that the people have never had it so good, public debt then was about 120% of GDP. Admittedly, it was on its way down from that peak of 250%. It's still, we've got used to this idea that government debt is always going to be very small.
But what we've also experienced that it grew dramatically, and rather than the wheels falling off the economy, it kept the wheels on the economy, because without that spending, so many people would have been unable to pay their rent, unable to pay their mortgage. Landlords would have been potentially sent bankrupt as well. Banks would have been sent bankrupt. There's no way a pure private sector economy would have survived COVID. Absolutely no way.
Yeah, and actually, so it's interesting, isn't it? Because on the one side we say, well, we want to draw back all that money now, but on the other side, it's obviously done quite a lot of good. So one thing it has done has stopped corporate debt rising quite so much. So Janus Henderson's corporate debt index, I was looking at, says that corporate debt jumped over 10% last year to an all-time high of $13.5 trillion through bond issuance, but most of that wasn't spent. So there's been very little additional debt taken on in 2021, which is amazing. That basically so many companies have survived through this thing. And a lot of that has been because there has been support from the government, furloughing wages, giving help where it's needed. And that's helped these companies survive.
Yeah, so we should be learning fundamentally that particular point of modern monetary theory. The government is not a money borrower; it's a money creator.
Yeah,
and it's not whether it doesn't have to borrow to spend; it spends to create money. So you don't have any problem about financing government spending. That is the lesson we could have learned. If you look back at the Second World War, that is the lesson that was learned in the Second World War as well. And we finally, the understanding is reversed by the growth of neoclassical economics, which is always has a child's understanding of a monetary system, sees it just as a barter system. But that mentality is so ingrained that even COVID hasn't disturbed it completely.
Well, is it going to be an interesting case study then? If we find that we go through a period, a year and a half, where the government has provided support to business, kept them afloat, and then when it starts to panic about how much debt it's racked up and starts to pull back, and we start to see businesses go to the wall, which is happening, by the way. So the number of company dissolutions in the UK last year was pretty much what it was the year before. And it's only in the last quarter, in Q2 and the beginning of Q3, that it's leapt up to rates far, far higher than it was, like 30% higher than it was in 2019. So it seems like they're pulling the money back now, the government money back, and companies are paying the price for that.
Yeah, and that's what worries me, that we're actually going to end up unnecessarily bankrupting corporations, having got them through the crisis of COVID. On the other side of it, we say, okay, now we're going to send you bankrupt because we're going to try to take money out of the economy in the belief we've got to pay our debt down. And by doing it, you're going to have a drop in your private sector cash flow and you're going to go bankrupt. Terribly sorry. That's not what our theory says will happen, so we're going to continue following our theory rather than what the practical experience of COVID should have taught us.
Yeah. And the other side of it, of course, was that, think they could pull back because the private sector was going to bounce back because public spending was going to bounce back. I mean, Andrew Bailey, was really selling that up, wasn't he? He seems to have gone quiet on. Andrew Bailey's the governor of the Bank of England, for those who don't know. But he was making a big point that we expect the economy to bounce back because people have got all this excess money sitting in their bank accounts because they weren't paying their train fares into London and the like. So they're all cashed up. And so they're going to be going out and buying, and that's going to save all these companies. He seems to have gone quiet on that because it's taken a while for that to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, and the other thing, which is, one thing I must say I did not expect with COVID was a house price bubble. But that seems to be a global phenomenon. House prices are rising virtually everywhere. And in some ways I would have liked us to learn that house price bubbles are not a road to permanent sustainable wealth. But whatever factors are behind it, whether people are, not because they're not spending on overseas holidays, they're thinking of, how do I make an investment for the future and what can I invest in? I'll buy houses. But there's...
Or I'll do at my house as well. So then part of it will be home improvements as well, that people are selling houses that have been done up more. Because they've invested the holiday money into DIY or adding an extension onto the house. But it's obvious, isn't it, why house prices are high? Because interest rates have been low for so long, and there's this expectation they're going to stay low forever.
That is part of it, but all, basically the bubble has been sustained by government policies as well. Australia is the classic instance of that. If every government policy is about making sure the house prices don't fall. The objective is to achieve expensive, affordable housing. And that seems to be a global phenomenon, which in some ways is a baby boomer versus the rest phenomenon, because it's the baby boomer generation that owns the housing, and it's the Gen X and Gen Y that can't get into the market in the first place. And rather than saying, well, we've got to drop prices so let Gen X get in here, they're trying to find ways to give money to the Gen X so that the Gen X can give 10 times that much money to the baby boomers, keep the bubble going. And that is, I must say, that's probably the most disappointing thing for me out of the whole process. I would have hoped that the housing bubble was ultimately pricked courtesy of COVID, and instead it's been inflated courtesy of COVID.
Well, there's been all sorts of strange things going on, haven't there? And we'll look at all of those in the full-length version of this podcast. Plus, if we had embraced modern monetary theory early on, how much of these strange behaviours could have been avoided? To hear all of that, you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen and you get access to this. And we've got 260 or so other podcasts in this series that you can listen to in full as well. That's it for this week, though. Back with another one with Steve next week. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.